He is risen. He is risen. He is risen. It is great to be here to celebrate that fact. And for those of you who are joining us for the first time, we're so glad you came on Easter Sunday of all Sundays of the year to come to celebrate something that I'll let you in a little secret. We celebrate it every single Sunday, and here's why. When the Jewish people used to gather for worship, they would gather on the Sabbath, which is Saturday, and that was their day of worship. But Jesus rose, the Bible tells us, on the first day of the week. And so from that time forward, when Christians would get together to worship, they would worship on the first day of the week to remember the victory that Jesus won over sin, death, and the grave in his resurrection, and to continue to look forward to the promise of his return. And so we continue that tradition every week, and once a year, the whole world recognizes that as we celebrate Easter. And so we're so glad you are a part of today's celebration, and we love to connect with you and know how we can serve you and your family. I was thinking about something just in the course of 5 or 10 years, how much technology has changed our world. You're all aware of that. But one of the things I realized as I was preparing for Easter Sunday is that I used to think, and I would even say occasionally on Easter, I would say, if only there had been cell phones in the first century. With everybody had a camera, and there was YouTube. Then suddenly, there would not be as much question about the resurrection because, Peter would have whipped out his phone and posted on Instagram, as I'm walking into the tomb, there's the clothes folded up, there's nobody around. I mean, you would have seen people, there would have been TikToks, and there would have been all the different things. And so suddenly there would have been this video evidence. I thought, well, if there were video evidence from the first century, then that might make a difference in terms of the world believing. And even to think about, God, if you were going to do all of this, and you said in the fullness of time, you sent your son to do this. I mean, I'm glad I'm not God. You should be really glad I'm not God. I would have just done it after cell phones and social media so that the message could have gotten out. But then I realized in the last 5 or 6 years, something incredible has happened. And that is the advent of deep fakes. You know what I'm talking about? Like now you watch videos and what you see on the video may not be real. And they've gotten so good that you can't even tell anymore. So then I thought, well, now we're right back to where we were in the first century, basically, that video evidence doesn't even necessarily equate to evidence. Today, when you listen to TV, you listen to podcasts, you listen to the news, it's big to have these sort of exposés of different things that are going on, whether it's in politics or whether it's true crime, people looking into all these details and exploring all these facts. And you can listen to 5 or 6 different things about one historic event and hear 5 or 6 different opinions that are on polar opposite sides of the same event. We can't even determine for ourselves what actually went on 5 years ago, let alone what happened 2,000 years ago. We can't agree on. So as I was thinking about that for this Sunday, realizing that maybe in some ways, this idea of evidence and this idea of proving something, we've sort of come all the way back around to something that we've always known is true, but maybe we forgot it for a little while when we were so fascinated with technology. And that is ultimately, a lot of these things have to do with faith. Like you can explore evidence, you can try to understand things, you can try to know what is facts and what is true, and you can research it all, and you should do that. And if you're here today and you don't necessarily know what Jesus did, or if you don't know the truth of the resurrection, you should explore that. But at the end of the day, everything that you are told, whether it's recent history, political history, or whether it's ancient history, is going to require at some point you make a decision that requires faith. There were no investigative journalists or podcasters in the first century. But if there were, and if they had been following the death of Jesus, if they had been following the story to try to determine, hey, what led to this man's crucifixion, then what happens today would definitely end up being a bonus episode. It would end up blowing everything you thought you knew about this case, about this man named Jesus. And while podcasters didn't exist in the first century, there were people who were just as careful and just as intentional about researching and documenting their discoveries. And so today, what I want to do is I want to look at a historic account from somebody who honestly had no skin in the game. This guy that wrote this historic account about the resurrection of Jesus was not Jewish, so he wasn't raised in all the Jewish traditions about the Messiah. He had no expectations about a Messiah at all. He wasn't particularly religious that we know of, and he was not one of Jesus' original followers. So he had no interest in getting a story out there that wasn't true. In fact, this person came to faith in Jesus much, much later after he had done his own research on the topic to determine for himself if it was true. Now, remember, he lived in the first century. He was contemporaries with people who witnessed the death of Jesus, who witnessed the resurrection. And yet he decided that he was going to do the research necessary to discover, what do I believe about this? But it wasn't just that he decided and studied this for himself. He shared that information. And at the beginning of this historic document that we know today as the Gospel of Luke, here's how he started it in Luke 1, verse 3 and 4. He says this: "Since I have investigated all the reports in close detail." Now, Luke was not just a historian, he was a physician. Now, in the first century, when you think about the first century, just the literacy rates alone would mean that if somebody could read and write, they were probably among the most educated of all the people in their community and on the planet at the time. So here he's saying, I have carefully investigated all this in close detail, starting from the story's beginning. So he didn't just start with the claim that the tomb was empty. He decided, who was this man that was crucified? What led him to be crucified? Where did he come from? What were his origins? So he said, I studied from the very beginning. I decided to write it all out for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you can know, here it is, beyond the shadow of a doubt, the reliability of what you've been taught. So here's what Luke is doing. He himself was not Jewish. He himself was not one of Jesus' followers, but he had heard the story. He's a doctor. He's a historian. He's educated. He goes about researching it all out. He knows of this person named Theophilus. He is writing not just to Theophilus, though. He's writing to a lot of people because he's saying, for all of you who have heard this story and you don't know what to believe about it, I want you to benefit from my research. I've written it all down. Here it is, from the beginning, you can study this. Now, if you think about this, when Luke is offering to Theophilus and to everybody who would read his work, evidence beyond the shadow of a doubt. That's a pretty bold claim. I'm giving you evidence beyond the shadow of a doubt. There's not much in this life that we can know beyond the shadow of a doubt. But Luke is saying, I'm telling you this because you can know it beyond the shadow of a doubt. But what is it about this story that created doubt? Well, it wasn't the fact that Jesus was arrested and crucified, because there had literally been thousands of people arrested by the Romans and crucified. In fact, when Jesus was crucified, there were 2 other people crucified that day with him. So it wasn't that. And if you go and look at Roman historians, Tacitus, and you look at Jewish historians like Josephus, what you will find is that these historians even themselves acknowledge that there was a man named Jesus who lived in the first century, that he was arrested and that he was put on trial before Pontius Pilate and that he was crucified. So that is not in question. In fact, most historians today, any historian, whether they're sacred or whether they're religious, whether they're irreligious, atheists, all historians today acknowledge that there was a man who lived in the first century named Jesus from Nazareth, who lived, who taught, who was ultimately arrested, tried, and crucified. So that's not what is within doubt here. What set Jesus apart from all the other people that were crucified? What stirred so much controversy? What launched a global movement that continues today? Because here's what I would also say. You would think, well, the answer is obvious because we're here on Easter. What sets him apart is the resurrection. But think about this. If you remember back to 9th grade, 10th grade world history class, you remember reading about somebody named Caesar Augustus. And there was a claim about Caesar Augustus that he made, that after he died, he rose from the dead and ascended to the heavens, where he continues to be this godlike figure that the Romans then began to worship. But 2,000 years later, there are not people gathered in every continent under trees and in great cathedrals talking about the resurrection of Caesar. So even the very idea of the resurrection itself isn't necessarily what causes so much investigation and has caused so much ink to be used to study this idea of the resurrection of Jesus. So what could it be about Jesus? Well, I want us to look at what this historian wrote down about the events of Jesus' death and his resurrection. So if you have a Bible, look with me at Luke chapter 23. We'll begin in verse 44. Now, here's what I know. Here's a danger for those of you who are familiar with this story. And almost all of you are probably familiar with this story. And that is, you've heard it again and again and again. And so you think you know everything that he's going to say, and you kind of check out. I know you do. I can see some of you check out. But here's what I want you to listen for. I don't want you to listen for the basic facts that you already know. I want you to listen for the level of detail that he is writing that is evidence for what took place. Okay, so Luke chapter 23, beginning in verse 44. Here's what he says. It was now about the 6th hour, and there was darkness over the whole land until the 9th hour, while the sun's light failed. Now, why is this important? Well, first of all, what he is doing already is giving you specific times. He is saying, basically, these things started at the 6th hour, which was about noon. It continued to the 9th hour, which was about 3. And mysteriously, the sky went dark. And the centurion of the temple was, curtain in the temple was torn in two. Then Jesus, calling out with a loud voice, said, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. And having said this, he breathed his last. Now notice something else he's saying here. He is saying, this was the day the veil in the temple was torn in two. What is he doing? He is giving you a date. He's giving you a specific date. Now the date, he doesn't say April 20th. He gives you something that you can remember because this was the day something significant happened. There was this veil in the temple that separated the holy from the holy of holies, where the Ark of the Covenant would have been kept and where this was the most sacred place in the temple. Well, on a particular day, inexplicably, the veil in this temple was ripped in two. It was torn. And everybody in Jerusalem and eventually the whole nation would have known that is so weird. Well, what Luke is saying is on that day, it would sort of been like saying for you, remember the day that you heard that the world was shutting down because of COVID? Or do you remember the day that a president or a historic figure was assassinated? Do you remember the day that you heard about 9/11? We all have times like that where it might not be a specific date, but you know exactly in history when that thing took place. That's what Luke is doing. He is time stamping this. He is saying it was on this day at this time that it happened. Now, when the centurion saw what had taken place, he praised God, saying, certainly this man was innocent. Here he's offering a witness. What is he doing? A centurion, not somebody who followed Jesus. This centurion had probably witnessed and overseen the crucifixion of hundreds, maybe even thousands of people. But there was this centurion who was there, and something that happened on the day that Jesus was crucified caused this centurion, this Roman centurion, to take notice and to acknowledge that this man was innocent. And then he gives more witnesses. All the crowds that were assembled for this spectacle, when they saw what had taken place, returned home, beating their breasts, and all his acquaintances and the women who had followed him from Galilee stood at a distance watching these things. He's saying, don't take my word for it. There are lots of people who witnessed. He's going to give you another name, he's going to give you another specific name. Now there was a man named Joseph from the Jewish town of Arimathea. He was a member of the council, a good and righteous man who had not consented to their decision or their actions, and he was looking for the kingdom of God. So now he's bringing yet another witness. Now remember, he is writing this in the first century. All these people, many of these people were probably still alive. So if Theophilus or anybody else who would have read this letter, all they would have had to do is take this document, go to Jerusalem, go to Arimathea and say, hey, I'm looking for a guy named Joseph. Can you point me to Joseph? Oh yeah, he lives 3 doors down around the corner. So he goes, he knocks on Joseph's door. He says, hey, I'm looking for somebody named Joseph. Can you verify for me what took place? And Joseph would have been like, yeah, I was there and I had been a secret disciple of Jesus. I mean, I put my whole career in jeopardy by coming out and saying, yes, I will find a place for Jesus to be buried. He's giving specific witnesses. So what did this man do? This man went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. Then he took it down and wrapped it in a linen shroud and laid it in a tomb cut in stone where no one had ever yet been laid. It was the day of preparation and the Sabbath was beginning. So there he is. He's giving you more specific times. He's telling you a date. He's telling you a part of the week it was. He's giving you specific time. He's giving you eyewitnesses. And he's even giving you details about the place where Jesus was buried. And you think, well, that's kind of a weird thing. Why would you say, from our context, why would you say that they took his body down and they laid it in a tomb where no one had ever been laid? Because I don't know about you, and I don't have any control over this, and neither do you, but I hope when my kids bury me, they don't They don't lay me, just dig up a hole and bury me with somebody else, like random person. I don't want a used grave. Do you? I mean, a used grave. Who would use a used grave? But the burial customs in the first century were very different than ours. What they would do is they would have these tombs that were cut out of stone, or they would be in caves, and there would be shelves in these caves where there would be multiple bodies, and they would take a corpse and they would add it to the collection in the cave. And it would lay there for about a year while it decomposed, and a year later they would go back in and they would collect the bones and put it in an ossuary, a small box. And that's where the bones, and then they would keep using the tomb over and over and over again. And what Luke wants you to know is that Joseph had a brand new tomb. Nobody had ever been in it. Nobody's were in it now. And so Jesus was the first and the only body in there. And that's going to be really important in just a minute. The women who had come with him from Galilee followed and saw the tomb and how his body was laid. Then they returned and prepared spices and ointment. On the Sabbath, they rested according to the commandments because they weren't allowed to finish preparing the body. It was getting close to the beginning of the Sabbath, so they had to rush and put the body in the tomb. They didn't prepare it properly. They couldn't do any work on the Sabbath, so there was nothing they could do. So they just waited through the Sabbath, and they were going to go on the first day of the week, early in the dawn. They went to the tomb, taking the spices they had prepared, and they found the stone rolled away from the tomb. But when they went in, they did not find the body of the Lord Jesus. We have a problem. Where's the body? Because you would have asked the question too, where's the body? You wouldn't have assumed what happened. You would have thought to yourself, somebody's taken the body. Somebody's come and taken the body. The Romans have done this. The high priests have done this. Maybe some of the disciples have come and done it. So while they were perplexed about this, behold, two men stood by them in dazzling apparel. And as they were frightened and bowed their faces to the ground, the men said to them, why do you seek the living among the dead? He is not here, but has risen. Remember how he told you while he was still in Galilee that the Son of Man must be delivered into the hands of the sinful men and be crucified and on the third day rise again? Don't you remember? You know, this kind of strikes me as interesting because if you read the whole account of Jesus' life, you find in his teachings, he said regularly what was going to happen. He was not hiding the ball here. He repeatedly said this, but nobody really heard it. It would be sort of like when you were growing up. You remember this? You were growing up and your parents would say something to you and you'd be like, yeah, whatever. And then suddenly you start adulting and you're like, oh, I remember when mom used to say that, right? Yeah. Suddenly your parents are a lot smarter than they used to be, right? It's sort of like that. Like they heard the words, but they didn't really hear the words. They didn't hear what he was saying. So here they are. They heard this, but they didn't know about it. And then they remembered his words, and returning from the tomb, they told all these things to the 11 and to all the rest. So who are the 11? Well, the apostles of Jesus. They're down by one. Judas has already gone off and hung himself after betraying Jesus. So it's the 11 and all the other disciples. Now it was, and here he's going to give you specific names. It was Mary Magdalene and Joanna and Mary the mother of James and all the other women with them who told these things to the apostles. But listen to this. But these words seemed to them an idle tale, and they did not believe them. Now why is that line important? Because if the entire New Testament is a fraud, if Luke is just trying to perpetuate a false story, why would you include that? Why would you include the fact that the disciples, the most holy people, the leaders of the church, why would you write out that even Peter and James and John, that none of them believed the women when they came to give the report? In fact, if you were writing this and you were trying to write it to convince the first century audience of these things actually happening, you wouldn't have had women be the people to go to the tomb and discover it was empty. The first witnesses would not have been women. They would have been men, and they wouldn't have just been any men. It would have been Peter. It would have been James. It would have been John. It would have been the pillars of the church going. And instead, what does Luke write? He writes what really happened. He's writing it because it's history. He is writing that, no, it was women. But wait a minute, Luke. Wait. Women aren't even allowed to testify in court. I know. Well, Luke, nobody's going to believe this. Maybe they won't believe it, but this is what really happened. And so I'm going to write down what really happened. And what really happened is that the women went to the tomb. They saw it was empty. They believed. They went to the disciples. And the disciples, who would go on, many of whom, to write more books than your New Testament. They're the ones who didn't believe, who rejected the news. But Peter rose and ran to the tomb. Stooping and looking in, he saw the linen clothes by themselves, and he went home marveling at what had happened. Now, this is a historic document. If you're here today and you're like, I don't know if I believe the Bible, I'm not even asking you to believe the Bible. I am just saying that if you were to read any historic document from the first century, and you were to read to learn about Caesar, or to learn about Augustus, or to learn about any of the Roman emperors, or you would have to look at some historic document to get the evidence and the facts that you would need to know to even have any idea what was going on. And all I'm suggesting is that here in this document, we have some of the most detailed evidence, and it's not just one person. It wasn't just Luke. It was another guy named Matthew, who was a tax collector. In other words, he was conspiring with the Romans. He was an outcast from the Jews, and he wrote about what happened. It was a guy named John, who was a young man when he first met Jesus, and he followed Jesus every step of the way, and he wrote down his firsthand account. It was a young man named Mark, who wasn't one of Jesus' followers, but he was related to Peter, and he began to write these things down. And then it was a guy named Paul, who didn't believe at all. He was a Pharisee. He was among those who would have wanted Jesus executed for claiming to be the Messiah. In fact, he went on to try to persecute the church. He came to believe, and he wrote down letters as well. It was a man named James, who was the brother of Jesus, who himself didn't believe Jesus or anything he said, until he saw him resurrected, and suddenly he believed. And he wrote a letter down. So all these documents, 27 different ancient texts that are collected for us in the New Testament. It's not just the Bible says this. It's that Matthew says it, and Luke says it, and Mark says it, and James says it, and Peter says it, and Paul says it. All this evidence that has been gathered here. But for what end? Why does it matter? Other people claimed to die, and said that their death was somehow going to be some sacrifice for the good of the world. Even other people claimed to be raised from the dead, Caesar Augustus being a great example. So what does this have to do with anything regarding our lives today and our faith? Well, here's what I think it tells us. The empty tomb is evidence that Jesus was not killed, but willingly laid down his life for the salvation of all who choose to believe. The empty tomb is evidence. The resurrection is evidence that Jesus, he was not killed by Pilate or Judas. He was not killed by Satan. He willingly laid down his life. Why did he do it? For the salvation of anyone who would choose to believe. You think, well, how does his death, when there were hundreds and thousands of other people who were crucified by the Romans, how would his death matter? Why would his death mean anything at all? Well, it wouldn't. No matter what he said, no matter what he claimed, his death would mean nothing except for the fact that he rose from the dead. Meaning that his death does have significance, and it does have meaning, and it can change a life even 2,000 years after the events took place. That his death means something for you today. It means salvation. And I'm not just talking about heaven when you die. I'm talking about a full and abundant life here and now. That it changes our perspective on life. It changes our perspective on the world. And it does that for anyone who would choose to believe. And that word is important because there's a lot of things that you and I probably believe. I mean, I believe in Benjamin Franklin. I believe in presidents and historic events, and I believe Abraham Lincoln delivered the Gettysburg Address. I believe all of those things. But my belief in those things doesn't change me. It doesn't save me. It certainly doesn't save me. So when we say that we find salvation for all who choose to believe, what does it mean to believe? Well, it's a different kind of belief. It's a belief that says when you got up this morning, you believed the sun would rise. You believed it. You trusted that it would. And your life depended on that fact. It's like when you put your money in a bank, you believe your money will be there when you go back to get it out. You believe that, or you wouldn't put your money there. It's like the fact that you have friends and family, a spouse, and you believe in them. You believe that they will be there for you. Not that they're perfect, but you believe. You have faith in them. This is what it means. That the fact that Jesus is raised from the dead means that he willingly sacrificed himself for your salvation if you will simply choose to put your faith and trust in it. Here's what the Bible says in Romans 10:9. If you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. Believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead. See, this isn't just about a historic event 2,000 years ago. This is about what we choose to do with the evidence that's been presented to us. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him would not perish, but would have eternal life. So when Luke was writing to Theophilus and he said, I'm offering you evidence beyond the shadow of a doubt, how can we believe beyond the shadow of a doubt? Let me give you just a few things today, and I'm specifically talking to those of you who have doubts, which, by the way, is probably most all of us, right? I mean, if we're honest, we might be feeling confident today, but there's a day coming where you might not feel so confident. Or there was a day recently where you didn't feel so confident. Or maybe you're here today on Easter because of some family obligation and you've never believed it. How can you believe this beyond the shadow of a doubt? Let me just share a few things with you that I think we pick up in this story. First of all, examine the evidence. That's exactly what Luke invites Theophilus to do, to examine the evidence. Notice in the account, he offers specific witnesses. The centurion, all the acquaintances, the crowd, the 11 disciples. And then he gives people by name. He names Joseph and Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, and Peter. He's giving specific. There were witnesses. There were specific times. The day of preparation, the day the veil of the temple was torn, the 6th hour, the 9th hour. This isn't like fiction literature. If you read fiction literature from the first century, they don't time stamp and date stamp things. That's not part of fiction. This is history being written. There were specific places. There was a new tomb that was freshly hewn out. And the women saw where it was. It was a specific place and location that people could have gone to. There were specific warnings that had been given. The women were reminded that Jesus said that this would happen. See, all of this evidence demands a verdict. It demands that we offer some kind of response to this evidence. In fact, today, I would just say, if you're exploring this, we would love to continue that conversation with you. We have a gift for you. It's a little book that is called The Case for Easter, and it is by a man named Lee Strobel. And it's important to know why Lee Strobel wrote this book. Lee Strobel was the legal correspondent for the Chicago Sun-Times. He was an atheist. And suddenly his wife comes to faith in Jesus. And Lee thought, this is terrible. This is going to ruin our lives. So he set out on a mission to disprove his wife. Not a good idea, guys. Never a good idea. So he thought, I'm a journalist. I know how to research. He's a lot like Luke. I know how to study this for myself. So he studied and studied and studied and studied. And he kept compiling evidence. And what he came to believe at the end was that, no, this is true. This really happened. And it changed his life. And so then he published his studies in a book called The Case for Christ. The section of that book that deals with the resurrection, we have got a small copy of that we would love to give any of you who are struggling with your own doubts, or maybe you have a family member who is, that just offers and invites you to examine the evidence for yourself. Not because I said it, not because your grandmother told you about it growing up, but examining it for yourself. The second thing is to identify your assumptions and question your doubts. Identify your assumptions and question your doubts. We all have assumptions. We come to anything that we are told with certain embedded assumptions in our mind. We also all come with doubts. Doubts aren't bad. They're just a part of the world in which we live. But here's what we do. We usually ignore our assumptions and we believe our doubts. We're not even aware that we have certain assumptions, but we choose to believe every doubt we have. And what I'm inviting you to do is to flip that around. I'm inviting you to identify, to know your assumptions, and to begin to question your own doubts. This is what the centurion did. He converted from Rome is right, Jesus must be guilty, to Rome is wrong, this man is innocent. This is what the women did. Someone must have moved the body or stolen the body. Suddenly, mysterious men in white appear. Why are you seeking the living among the dead? And the women came to the tomb with their assumptions that Jesus' body would be there, and if it wasn't, it was because somebody stole it. Luke's honesty about the women being the first to witness the tomb was remarkable. In fact, listen to what theologian and historian Tom Wright says about this: if Luke had been making this story up a generation or more after the event, as people sometimes suggest, not only would he not have had women going first to the tomb. Women were not regarded as credible witnesses in the ancient world, as the story itself bears out. He would have had the apostles believe the story at once, ready to be models of faith and to lead the young church into God's future. Not so. It seems to them a silly fantasy, exactly the sort of thing they will have thought that you'd expect from a few women crazy with grief and lacking of sleep. You see, they all had to question their assumptions and question their doubts. The disciples did this. Jesus wasn't who they'd hoped he was. They had thought he was the Messiah, but Messiahs aren't killed on Roman crosses. The crucifixion could have made Jesus a martyr, or it could have sealed his credibility as a prophet, but it certainly did not give evidence, absolute evidence, that he was the Messiah. If anything, it proved the opposite. Messiahs don't die at the hands of their oppressors. Jesus died at the hands of the Romans. Therefore, Jesus cannot be the Messiah. They had their assumptions. They had their doubts. Do you know what yours are? What are your assumptions about Jesus? What about your doubts about the resurrection? Is he just another good moral teacher? The founder of another of world religions? Is he irrelevant, just another legend or just another myth? How do you know? How do you know that? You have chosen to believe that. But how did you come to believe that? Because there is evidence that if you haven't considered it first, it demands a verdict from you before you make up your mind about something that could affect your life and your eternity. Isn't it worth studying it for yourself? See, you're going to believe in something. All of you believe in something. Everybody in here believes in something. Have you identified what that is? Are you like the women looking for the living among the dead? Listen, I want to give you a word of encouragement today. If you are here and you're doubting and you're questioning, doubt is not the end of faith. It's the beginning. It is only when we begin to recognize our doubts that we receive the invitation to seek truth and have faith. So if you doubt, it's okay. You're in good company. Peter doubted, and James doubted, and John doubted. They all doubted. But they did something I hope you'll do. They examined the evidence. And finally, we have to act in faith. That's what the centurion did when he declared Jesus innocent. It's what Joseph did when he came out from the shadows to say that he followed Jesus and to offer his tomb. It's what the women did when they went to tell the disciples that Jesus was alive. It's what Peter ultimately did. But these words, Luke 24:11, but these words seemed to them like idle tales, and they did not believe them. But Peter rose and ran to the tomb. What I'm asking you to do this Easter is to be like Peter. You may doubt. You might actually have serious doubts. But will you take those doubts and run to the empty tomb? This is the invitation of Easter. To believe in something that doesn't just give you a life insurance policy for what happens after you die, but it gives you the power to change, to believe, to have hope today in this life and for eternity. Will you examine the evidence and find the hope that is in the resurrection? I'm going to ask you to bow your heads and pray with me.